Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Bridging the Divide Between Corporates and Early Stage Startups. My name is Anthony Schiavo, Senior Director and Principal Analyst here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating and presenting during today's session. And I'm joined here by Kevin C., Head of Ecosystem at Activate. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have into the question box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, just refresh your browser and check your internet connection. And now, let's jump into the presentation. Kevin, thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start here. I think one thing that we're hearing consistently from our clients, and I think in today's webinar, I'm really going to be representing the client perspective, the large corporate innovator perspective, and Kevin is going to be representing more of a startup perspective, right? And we're going to fully explain your role at Activate and what you do in a second. But I think what we're hearing across the board is that we're entering this new era of innovation with a lot more pressure. And I'm kind of calling it the Jenga era of innovation, because it feels like innovators are being asked to do their job while the Jenga blocks are being pulled out from underneath them. We have more pressure on profitability, more cuts to headcount, reduced budgets, shorter timelines, and a lot of uncertainty around government incentives. And in clean tech and hard tech, venture capital has really started to dry up. So companies and innovators are under a lot of pressure to deliver because innovation is still crucial, right? We know that innovation is still critical to managing and preparing for some of these big changes, things like the energy transition. And we know that it's also a crucial part of the path to profitability for large corporations. You can't just abandon innovation when times get tough. And so today, we're going to be talking about this big question of how can corporate innovators and founders work together, and how can really they work together to solve and to meet some of these challenges in this new innovation environment. But first, we're going to get a bit of an introduction to Kevin and to Activate. And then after that, we'll give a bit of an outlook on where we think the innovation ecosystem is going and what the potential is in the future. So Kevin, thanks so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you to really introduce yourself and talk about what Activate is and what do you do there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Anthony. So I am the head of ecosystem at Activate. I'm briefly, by way of background, scientist by training, very familiar with Lux, spent a large amount of time there, the first part of my career there, leading product and research teams in areas across energy, climate, and also digital technologies like AI. So supporting innovation clients, that was the first kind of part of the journey that is relevant to this particular topic. Then I jumped to the startup side, and I led product at an AI startup called Geminis, where I also worked in business development and trying to develop relationships with corporates. And now I'm the head of ecosystem at Activate, which I'll describe in a second. And it's really, we are a nonprofit that is founded on the principle that there are global challenges that need to be solved by science, but specifically the ability to bring science to market. And so for us to solve these things, we need people who are not only able to create and really invent things, but also find a way to pull them out of the lab and into the market. So Activate is a fellowship program. We are a nonprofit that provides non-dilutive funding to scientist founders to do exactly what I just described, pull technology out of the lab and into the market. And so we do this with a few mechanisms. One is essentially a safety net in terms of a stipend to de-risk personally the ability for these brilliant scientists to take the leap into founding and launching a startup. So that it has $100,000 per year in terms of a stipend. Also, this is a 2-year program, so that's over 2 years. There's $100K in R&D funds to kick off the de-risking and scale up to the initial prototyping and things like that. Around them, though, we form a community. And so I'll talk about this in a second, but we are a community-based fellowship program, which brings people into our program via cohorts. And so we have 5 different communities. So each of those communities is staffed by teams with experienced entrepreneurs as managing directors who have been through the exact challenges that these founders will face, but also a support team around them to help drive programming, curriculum, mentorship, and coaching. And this is where I sit. I'm the head of ecosystem, so I both coach and mentor on the essentially the customer discovery, product market fit, business development side, but also try and drive meaningful introductions and collisions, we call them, for them to drive that process forward. But we have people across the board that are supporting fellows all across the country. We have a curriculum that we've created that is tailored towards the scientist founder. And really, we have also this great ecosystem around Activate, including partners like Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and others to really fill in all the gaps that these founders face. The key thing I think I want you to take away from why does Activate exist and does it work? And really, to answer that question, we believe there's a pretty resounding yes. So we have almost 250 fellows over the course of the program, which the inception was 2015, creating nearly 200 science-based companies. One metric you could look at is follow-on funding. And so our companies that came through our program have raised over $3.5 billion cumulatively since the inception of the program, which is a pretty good return on the dollars we put in. They typically raise over $5 million over the course of the fellowship. They're creating jobs, they're driving revenue. And notably, the great significant majority of them are still alive, which in itself is an accomplishment. I mentioned the community-based nature. We started in Berkeley, then moved to Boston, then New York, launched a virtual community called Activate Anywhere, and then most recently launched in Houston. And so really a broad representation across the country, forming ecosystems across the board, bringing entrepreneurs from all over. I'll talk about a few examples very briefly later in the webinar, but these are some of the logos you can see. Who are the companies that came through? I think you'll recognize a good number of them actually, because in their own right, they've become very meaningful companies in the landscape today. So we're really proud to be associated with all of the companies that you can see here and more.
And I think what really stands out to me is some of these statistics, right? 96% of these companies still being active. That's extremely enviable, especially taken from such an early stage. And yet, what I hear consistently from my clients is that they are not interested, or that they don't think they can work with companies who are at this very early founder stage, right? They want to focus on companies who are Series A, Series B, or even later. And so there's this disconnect, I think, between this huge opportunity to work with these really high value innovators and, these corporates. So we need to address this gap and address how these companies can work together. And that's really what we're going to talk about in the rest of this webinar is how can corporate innovators and founders work together? Because there is such a big opportunity to access these technologies. And I think the most important thing, or one of the core thing to address first, is really building the case for why corporates should work with founders and overcome some of those hesitancies, overcome some of those concerns. And there's, I think, 3 key reasons. One is that you can build an innovation portfolio with these individually sort of low risk, high return engagements with early stage startups. And what I mean by that is with a relatively small commitment of funds, and we're going to talk about funds in a little bit, you can support research that has a huge potential impact. And so with the same spend as you might have on just a handful of Series A companies, you can support a far more diverse portfolio of technology development efforts with early stage founders. Two, there's a much greater opportunity to really shape the direction of technology development. Kevin mentioned that his role is really about tech and market selection. And this is really where the rubber is meeting the road for the first time. And these companies are going from just having IP to really figuring out product market fit. And so there's a huge opportunity for corporate innovators to get in on the ground floor of that process and really help ensure that the technology is shaped to really beneficially meet their needs. And three is speed. And I think this is really crucial because there's a lot of pressure, and we hear from a lot of our clients, we need to do things in the next 2 years, in the next 3 years. And while that pressure is always going to be there, if you can engage with these early stage founders, that means when your CEO asks you, hey, this new technology, we need to make something happen in the next 2 years, in the next 3 years. If you already have an engagement with an early stage company, if you already have an agreement in place, you've tested some products, you've maybe bought some products, you can move so much more quickly than trying to scale these technologies from scratch. So when it gets to that time to scale, when that pressure comes on, you can really move quickly if you're engaging with these early stage companies. But this is the big question, right? Where does this go wrong? Because I think it's a good idea. Everyone recognizes, yeah, it would be great to work with founders. But I think everyone has heard the horror stories, certainly from the startup perspective, Kevin, and even from the corporate innovator side. I think the common understanding is that these two groups are too different to really work together successfully. So let's dig in. Let's ask where this goes wrong. And I think when we were discussing this, there were really three sort of key areas, right, that came up in our discussions. And the first was clarity on process. So what do startups need from corporate innovators here on process, Kevin?
Yeah, and I'm speaking from the perspective of startups, not to certainly just slam corporates, but from the perspective that doing this right from the perspective of the startup also helps the corporate get results that are meaningful and not a waste of their resources. So the first thing that we run into oftentimes as startups are that we don't know who makes decisions, who are the stakeholders we have to convince. Is someone going to pop up later in the process that's key to unraveling everything if they're not happy? So there's a lot of clarity that can be really brought to bear upfront on essentially, the front door might be the innovation group. From there, who are all the stakeholders? Is it going to go to R&D? Is it going to go to a business unit? As early in the process as possible to lay that out so that there's an expectation that the startup knows who they need to know. Because often that's a big gap in them executing a successful early engagement even. And really connected to that are the steps involved in developing a deeper relationship. And so by that, I mean, you might meet with an innovation group and say, present your technology, get interest alignment with the needs of the business. And then the innovation person pulls in a business unit, and then you do another proof of technology from a conceptual standpoint. And then maybe you start to graduate towards designing some kind of actual technical work, material transfer agreement, experiments, other things that are the bedrock of the very earliest proof of technology. I'm giving these examples as, can you as a corporation lay out the steps that someone should expect as they navigate through this process, understanding that at some point you might not make it to the next step. And so really understanding what the bottlenecks, the gates, but also what success looks like, I think is extremely valuable for startups to set expectations. And the last part of that is, how important is this? Generally, the bar is fairly high to bring something in at all, but it's important to know, is this part of your 5-year plan to create a business in this space? Or are your competitors doing something in this space and you're trying to catch up? Obviously, you can only reveal so much, but really understanding how critical a particular technology or startup is to that roadmap is really valuable.
Yeah, and I think like Kevin said, this is something that having this clarity of process is hugely beneficial, not just when dealing with early stage founders or startups, but really at all times for your own internal projects, your own internal efforts, right? So building this clarity of process is something that I think is absolutely critical. And we see a big bottleneck here when it comes to transferring between the innovation teams and any other team. The moment you have to bring like a business unit in, often that's like a big bottleneck. So knowing that that is coming down the road, I think is hugely important to making this successful. The second thing we really hit up was this element of timing and speed. You know, startups are on the clock, time is money, right? And I think this is often where a lot of corporate innovators run afoul. And I think there's some kind of simple things that we can do to really improve the speed at which we're moving through these processes.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I'm curious, what's your perspective on this, Kevin?
Yeah, I think, linked to the process question that we just discussed on the previous slide is not only what the steps are, but how long they take. I cannot emphasize enough how important speed and pace is for a startup. And it is something we preach consistently to our startups, that they have to move fast. Changes come fast, pivots happen. They are constantly in a highly dynamic state. And so corporates at least need to be aware of that and understand how they can help facilitate that being done in a productive way. Second to that is, not every relationship works out, and that's okay. What's a killer is if you spend a year or two and then it doesn't work out. Mm-hmm. That hurts. It hurts a lot, and it can actually kill a company. And so really understanding the alignment, if the answer is no, as painful as that may be, don't waste each other's time, because time for a startup is really about survival. And so everybody should be on the same page about ultimately, is this headed in a direction that is fruitful for both parties? And the last thing I'd say is agreements, legal, material transfer, all these things, how much can we standardize them? Because frankly, lawyers cost a lot of money. And if I haven't made that clear, most startups don't have a lot of money to burn on stuff like that. And so can we facilitate more standardization in these types of agreements to essentially cut down on the friction to getting to actual fruitful agreements?
And, you mentioned money is important, and I said time is money earlier, but money is also money, as it turns out. And it really does matter more than ever. And I think this is where there's a pretty common attitude that I've seen from the corporate innovation perspective, that what corporate innovators can bring is in-kind services, R&D capabilities, facilities, validation, market access. And it's not to say that all that stuff isn't good, but startups need money. And I think this is one of the points where you were most adamant, and maybe where I was most surprised by how big the disconnect was here. So, what's going on? And what have you been seeing in your work with these startups?
Yeah, I think this is like a very variable experience depending on the personality of the founder. Mm-hmm. And it's challenging because some of them, frankly, aren't comfortable asking for money. As funny as that may sound, that's not a natural inclination for a scientist in many cases, right? And so the fact of the matter is, validation is super critical to the success of a company. You could share that to VCs, you could share that to other customers. That's great. De-risking the technology by maybe providing services and characterization, other things, that's great. I keep coming back to the fact that every dollar that they're not bringing in is just reducing their runway. So something that corporates don't, a word that startups use all the time that corporates don't is runway. Talk about it literally every day, right? And so startups are taking major risks just by committing to a project. As much as they should, you might think they should be happy to be working with you, there's a very real chance they invest a lot of time, a lot of effort, don't get any money from it. Maybe it's a partnership that doesn't work out. And as I mentioned before, that could be a death knell, or it could be a serious setback. So ultimately, is there a norm we can build, not to break the bank, not to bilk the corporation, but to provide some funding to help make this work more successful, more likely to get to good outcomes?
Yeah, I think that is really crucial. We're not talking about a lot of money here, right? We're talking about, this is not Series A money, this is not VC money, this is, paid work essentially. But the difference between paying for that work and not is huge in terms of the risk profile that the startup ultimately ends up taking on, and the options that they have to really develop the technology going down the road. And I mean, I know we've been talking about this, like this question of why do this, and I think there are these big high-level reasons, diversifying your innovation portfolio, but ultimately what it comes down to is accessing technology, right, Kevin?
Absolutely. And so I can certainly understand the perspective of only engaging at later stages, right, when things have been de-risked, et cetera, and you can look towards scale up or other maybe more easily developed business cases. The reason why I believe engaging early is important is that there are huge, impactful companies and innovations that are being born almost all the time. And Activate, that's our function, is actually to help get these technologies out of the lab and into the market. So just to give you some examples, all these companies, I would assume most of you have heard of them. These are category defining companies in most cases: Fervo, Sublime, Brimstone, 12, Antora, Electrified Thermal Solutions. Really, like, sometimes not just leaders, but creators of a category, right? And we know that these are in the position they're in because, in large part, these are seen as the future markets, huge markets that will grow very quickly due to a variety of external factors, right? If I were a corporate, I would want to have mechanisms to be able to get to these things early, to be able to create relationships, and to the point you made in the beginning, to be prepared when things cross over that threshold, to be able to scale with these companies and be important partners so that you get a share of this growth.
And you talked about these category leaders, but obviously Activate, you guys bring in a new cohort twice a year, right?
Yeah, once a year we bring in a new cohort over the 2-year period. So it's incredibly exciting to see the next wave come in every year, and we're actually going through the selection process as we speak. But to look at some of the companies that are in the program right now, just to call out, and this is not to play favorites, but to just pick out some in areas that may be of interest to your client base, is, well, what if we could make ammonia at low temperature and low pressure? Or have a way of capturing carbon and storing it using seawater and light, which is what Banya is doing. Solidec, really exciting company, creating chemicals and fuels from water, air, and CO2, right? So again, standard potential, really unlocking the ability to scale and take a lot of the cost out of deployment of sodium-ion batteries. So this is what gets us up every day, is that there's more and more of these every year. And so the reason why people engage with us is to see and learn and engage with these companies early in that journey, because something to take note of is how fast they move. Although there's the stereotype that these are capital intensive and it's going to take however long, that's true, but they also make very fast progress, faster than you can imagine. And so they get to different stages where they need to unlock the next steps very regularly. And that's where partners can play a big role and also gain the benefits of being part of that journey.
Yeah, I think the message I would just send to my clients is probably the biggest thing standing in the way of, you working with these, potential future category leaders is just your own internal processes, right? And your own internal beliefs about what corporate innovation can and can't do, should and shouldn't do. So by challenging those and by changing those processes and beliefs, I think you can really unlock engagement with a next generation of really impressive startups. So we've talked about this. I think we've highlighted a lot of the challenges, but I do want to actually say, what are some of the solutions, right? And I think first, it's really crucial that before you begin to engage with founders, before you go and meet with these companies, that you get the buy-in and you have the innovation portfolio on doing this, low cost, high ROI engagement strategy, right? You don't want to start engaging with a startup and then have to go to your CEO and justify, hey, here's why we should be engaging with founders at all, right? If you don't have that buy-in already, it's going to be really challenging to move quickly enough to make these engagement works, right? And secondly, you need that corporate strategy, right? I don't think this is a place where, a skunkworks approach or a more general sort of we'll just pick whatever looks interesting type approach works. These are companies who really need market validation, who really need technical validation, and that means knowing what you need as a corporation, so you can say, yes, this is something we're interested in. This solves a problem for us. This meets a strategic priority. And lastly, you really need to think about, the innovation ecosystem is a human ecosystem, right? And ultimately, your reputation as someone who startups want to work with is really crucial. And, there are definitely companies who have a sterling reputation in this space, and there are companies who have a reputation that's not as sterling. And so you really need to think about how can we be a good actor in this ecosystem? And there are a lot of specifics as well, and I think you called some of these out to me, Kevin. But what are some of the more concrete steps that you think corporate innovators can take to make this work?
So, yeah, circling back to the points we made earlier about process, I think if you don't already have a template for how to engage with startups at various stages, but certainly the early stages, I would say develop one, and develop a way to share what it is. Have a very clear and simple framework that you can share with your partners so that they understand the problem they're solving, what results or what deliverables are proof or validation that you've solved or are on the path to solving those problems, and set expectations along the way. I mean, I can't emphasize enough, clarity and expectation setting is always a good thing and always helps facilitate getting good results. This one, certainly harder because every corporation is different and there's different concerns, but is essentially to try and template the agreements you use with startups. We, for example, have piloted and prototyped the Simple Partnerships Agreement, or SIPA that we call it, that is aiming at a template for these engagements to set deliverables, to set compensation, et cetera, that startups don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they write a proposal or write a partnership agreement. In the startup world, it's common to have these templated agreements, whether it's safe notes for investment or the fast advisor agreement to bringing on startup advisors. Yes, the simple question is, for these meaty engagements, is there any way to facilitate or streamline those engagements from a documentation standpoint? The last thing is important because we talked about the importance of money and financing. I've heard from corporates in my past interactions that sometimes spending $50,000 can be as hard as spending millions of dollars. Like, the process is the same, even though the scale shifts dramatically. And so if you really want to have an agile portfolio approach that you described earlier, can you create a mechanism to actually fund some of these early pilots or early proof of technologies, pick the winners and move them forward, have more shots on goal, and be a good partner to the startups? I think that creates a lot more of an agile way to move these agreements forward or move these relationships forward on a faster scale.
And I wanted to take this last moment to really ask, what is possible, right? I mean, we've talked about something that I think represents a pretty significant change to the way innovation works. I mean, what are you hoping to achieve with, with Activate and with these potential changes to the innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, something we're really interested as an organization is alternative pathways, we call it, to financing a startup. And really an alternative to VC. And VC is the right choice in many circumstances and certain stages. But there are some technologies and some teams that do move fast enough where it may become feasible to fund the company off of non-dilutive sources, including partnership or customer revenue. I think that's really attractive to us because the ability to generate revenue in that way is kind of on multiple levels an incredible validation, because you're bringing money in, which is helping your company sustain itself based on the fact that you've solved a real problem. And so I love the idea of being able to more sustainably fund or self-finance companies because you're already solving problems. And call me optimistic or ambitious, but I think even in hard tech that this is possible.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I'll maybe even go a little further. And I'll say, first of all, I think what's really crucial is that this represents, when it's successful, real problems getting solved, right? Corporates leveraging these early stage founders to solve real challenges at a stage and with the speed that they didn't think was possible, right? They thought they had to wait until startups were Series A or Series B or fully scaled before they could really start working with them. And secondly, I think I'll say, in a lot of cases, this VC funding, it introduces just as many challenges as it solves, right? A whole new set of priorities, a whole new set of outcomes that aren't always aligned with the innovation ecosystem and aren't always aligned with the best interests of either the startup or the corporate. So removing that pressure and creating these alternative funding sources, I think we really can create a startup ecosystem that works better for everyone involved, and that includes the corporate innovators. So just the last few thoughts. One, I really do think this is a time for founder engagement. I think a big part of this, we didn't really touch on it, but I do think corporate innovators have much better skills than they did even a decade ago. I think in general, corporate innovation teams are much more sophisticated in their ability to identify and work with startups now. So I think this is possible in a way it wasn't before. Two, I really do see this ecosystem as emerging. I mean, we talked about VC funding, but you saw that chart in the previous slide. More than half of VC funding, or roughly half of VC funding, has left the clean tech space already. So there's really a need for this new ecosystem. And lastly, this does, even though this is an early stage engagement, it means more speed down the line and allows companies, I think, to scale more quickly and for innovation teams to scale their impact on the corporate side more quickly if they're already in good position. And so with that, we have just a little bit of time left for questions. I want to thank you all for joining us here. If we're not able to get to your question, we will follow up with you after the webinar. But Kevin, there's a good question here. I've seen this come in. We've talked a lot about corporate innovators, and that's maybe the focus of this presentation. But what advice or what feedback or maybe what criticism would you give to the founders, right? What can they do better to work with the corporate innovation teams? And how can you see that changing?
The most basic advice I tend to give is ask questions. which surprisingly, or maybe not, is not a natural inclination for many people. It's not comfortable. But all the things we raised that I have on my wish list for what a future state looks like, the fact of the matter is many corporations will not be equipped with the answers to those questions, or they won't volunteer them. And so you get them by asking. So you have to ask about the process. You have to ask about the importance. You have to ask about the stakeholders. So a lot of the things we discussed today, I think, could be really a template for the questions they should be asking in the absence of someone sharing it openly, right?
And we're a little up on time here, but there's one more question, which is, we talked about some of these tougher conditions. How long do you think they'll last? And I think from Lux's perspective, this is probably at least a multi-year period that we're in, where there's more pressure, tighter timelines, companies really refocusing on profitability, CEOs being really focused on, the P&L, the near-term P&L. So I think we're really looking at a couple of years of this period, but there's no time like the present to really build these capabilities. And there's always going to be a moment in the future where someone asks you, hey, what about this big picture long-term thing? What are we doing there? And you will want to be ready with an answer. You will want to be ready with some relationships and some technologies that you're positioned there. So this is always going to be an evergreen challenge. And with that, I think we just want to say thank you. If we did not get to your question, we will follow up. The slide presentation and the recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email today. After leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we really appreciate the feedback. So that helps us inform, our future webinars, and please encourage you to check out, all of our other webinars coming up in the future. We have a lot of great stuff coming up. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. Kevin, thank you so much for really being willing to share your perspective with our clients. And have a great day.
Thanks, Anthony.